I chose this topic for my intern project because upon my research, I have not found a lot of conversation about CT strategies that go beyond military intervention, and I want to know how we can create a safer world in a more peaceful manner. I kindly ask that you keep your mics muted throughout the panel and that you send me your questions through chat and including who your question is directed at. At the end of the panel, I will choose your questions and ask them of your panelists for you. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our speakers, starting with ladies first and then in alphabetical order. Ambassador Susan Ziadeh, a distinguished diplomat with a 23-year career in the U.S. Department of State, served as the U.S. ambassador to Qatar from 2011 to 2014 and held senior positions in Riyadh, Baghdad, Bahrain, and several other Middle Eastern capitals, while earning multiple prestigious awards for her leadership and contributions to public diplomacy. She will be speaking based on the perspective of diplomacy tonight. Ambassador Douglas Lute, a retired lieutenant general with 35 years of service, served as the U.S. ambassador to NATO from 2013 to 2017, where he played a pivotal role in addressing Europe's most significant security challenges post-Cold War, and previously coordinated U.S. military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan as Deputy National Security Advisor. He will be speaking based on the perspective of the military tonight. Ambassador Ronald Newman is the president of the American Academy of Diplomacy and a former U.S. ambassador to Algeria, Bahrain, and Afghanistan, with a distinguished career in the senior foreign service, and is the author of several books, including Three Embassies, Four Wars, and The Other War, Winning and Losing in Afghanistan. He is moderating tonight's event. Dr. Ken Yamashita, a career minister in the senior foreign service, is a former U.S. aid officer with extensive counterterrorism experience, having served in countries including Afghanistan, Colombia, and Kosovo, and is recognized for his leadership in international development and for initiating the first women's empowerment program in Afghanistan. He will be speaking based on the perspective of U.S. aid. Without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic on to Ambassador Ronald Newman.
Eileen, thank you very much. Thank you to my colleagues for doing this. I know them sufficiently well to doubt that any of them will stay in one box throughout the discussion, and indeed they shouldn't, because I think one of the themes you're going to hear more of is not only are the causes of terrorism multiple and difficult, but the idea that there is a single tool, or that you choose one tool over another. I often think this is, nobody would ask a plumber, do you need a wrench more than you need a screwdriver? I mean, they're alternate tools, and you use them together or separately, depending on the job, or you go out and get something more expensive. But they're not alternatives, and I think we'll find that in the panel tonight. So without more stage setting, I want to start, though, with Dr. Yamashita, because the question has often come up whether, if you could sufficiently develop countries, whether the incentive for terrorism would go away, which is a somewhat simplistic formulation. But Ken, I think you could take the question beyond that and talk a little bit about what is the proper role of development? How does it fit into the timeline of dealing with terrorism? And what ought one to think about in terms of its limitations?
Yeah, thanks, Ron and Eileen. Thanks very much for organizing this. I was thinking about the topic of today's presentation, and Ron, you put it, I thought, perfectly well when you started with your example of the plumber and the wrench, which I would say also doesn't work if the underlying infrastructure is, if the larger pipes are completely clogged up and not working, then the short-term pipe and wrench will not work. I think of development, the way we often think about development is really the social and private sector, economic growth, health, agriculture, and so on. We often don't think about the security sector as a development sector. And I think that that's one of the shortcomings that we can get into more in our conversations. The other piece is what I would call political and governance organization. And oftentimes we call it DG, democracy, governance, human rights, and so on. But an underlying theme is, how is it that government is responding to the needs of its people? Or is it responding to the needs of the people? And where there's a breakdown in those all three components, that government is not responding, that the security sector is isolated, that economic growth, health, agriculture are not progressing, then that generates a frustration and distrust and anger, if you will, by the people towards the government, and it generates a milieu in which perhaps a limited number of actors, sensing that there's an opportunity for a more violent reaction, take it, and leads to extremism or terrorism.
Thank you. That'll get us started. I want to go to Susan, Ambassador Ziad, and Susan, you've had multiple experiences in this. Where do you start in your own mind in policy, in considering how you blend these elements of diplomacy, economic aid, and military in a strategy? Where do you start in considering this? How would you bring it together?
Yeah. Ultimately, it seems to me if you're looking at a counterterrorism strategy, one of the main underpinnings is how you contain and disrupt, dismantle, and then stabilize. And all of those elements have development, have military, have a whole host of elements within them. And their elements by their nature will be combined, and they work in tandem and they complement one another. But an effective strategy really depends upon the diplomatic factors that go into formulating the policy. And I think first and foremost, and I think the US has been actually pretty successful in this over the years, has been coalition building. How you build those relationships, those partnerships, how you bring other countries on board, and in that process, how you develop a consensus vision, how you leverage their resources and their knowledge in formulating a counterterrorism policy. Now, mind you, this type of strategy is constantly evolving. It is a process, and it requires a lot of care and tending, a lot of diplomatic skill to keep a vision and a policy on track, and to keep it within the consensus where all the partners are on board together in terms of our vision. And I think we've seen that certainly in if I can pick one example, the counter-ISIS campaign, or the de-ISIS campaign, as it later became known, the defeat ISIS campaign, where we worked with our partners in the region, in the countries where we had the issue of ISIS, particularly initially in Iraq, but also with other European and other Arab regional partners, to be able to come up with a diplomatic strategy that was agreed upon in a way that underpinned the more critical military strategy, which in the end did defeat ISIS. And part of that, of course, was working with local partners, which was, again, part of the diplomatic strategy to come up with the military campaign that was ultimately successful.
I think that's a very good transition to General Lute, Ambassador Lute, otherwise Doug. And this question of how do you make the transition? But not only that, but how you never really transition from one to another. You might transition out of the military piece, but you never transition out of the diplomatic piece, even when you're in the midst of the military. And let me just leave you good amount of freedom here, considering how do you blend, where do you see the biggest obstacles in bringing these things together successfully? What do people have to keep focused on?
Right. Well, so Ron, let me first open by saying that I applaud the Academy for sponsoring this effort. And in particular, I applaud the Academy for putting a bit of responsibility on the shoulders of our interns and causing interns like Elaine to conceive this, organize it, and actually execute it because it's a really good experience for the next generation. And our generation, frankly, is not leaving you, a bag of goodies. So it's good that you're getting some exposure early, and I applaud the Academy for that. Ron, on this topic broadly, I think about diplomacy, military development, and so forth, as ways to approach a national objective. So in the military, we are trained to think about strategy as a three-part approach, right? So ends, ways, and means. Ends are national objectives. Ways are the three topics that we're talking about today. So diplomacy, allies, regional diplomacy, global diplomacy, development, military, and so forth, and then means, right? So the resources. So troops, diplomats, intelligence officers, dollars, allies, time, and so forth. So when we talk about ways, like the three that we're focused on this evening, we're always talking about them in a blended way and in a complementary way, and not in exclusion, one in exclusion of the others. Now, as strategy is initially developed and then executed, the ways will change over time. They'll be blended in different priorities. One may take priority early, followed by the others. They'll be sequenced differently. And in some cases, you'll have concurrent activity, military diplomatic development, and others, they'll be sequenced. And I think there are a couple observations from the last sort of 20 years of this activity that we might talk about. One is that I think it's quite clear, as the military voice on the panel this afternoon, that we have tended to prioritize and almost become fixated on military means, and to some at some expense of the others. And I remember long debates about numbers of troops in Iraq or Afghanistan, for example. And only late in those games, did we appreciate the role of number of diplomats, the role of regional diplomacy, the role of bringing allies along, the role of development, and development not only at the capital of Kabul or Baghdad, but out in the provinces and so forth, in the development of innovative approaches like provincial reconstruction teams and so forth, right? So one observation is we tended to get fixated on the shiny object, which is number of troops and military approach. And what I think we learned in the school of hard lessons is that that's not sufficient. That can give you a temporary suppressive effect on a terrorist or an insurgent challenge, but it can't deliver the end result that you want. And I think that's something we may want to try to focus on. The other is that because we fixated, in my view, on the military, we cause the military to try to do things that they're not organized, trained, and equipped to do. So military officers are not diplomats. Military officers and non-commissioned officers and soldiers are not development professionals. So if tasked to do those things, they'll give it their best in a great can-do attitude approach. But the results are not going to be what we might expect from the true professionals who have 10, 20, 30 years of experience in these very specific very challenging settings. So beware, I suppose, if there were a lesson here, beware fixating on the military, which can deliver some short-term effects, but difficult delivering longer-term effects. And beware tasking the military because of that fixation, tasking the military to do things for which it's not prepared.
I think that's a very good observation. When you were speaking, you reminded me of a colleague at a military institution once. We were talking, who said, in terms of this can-do attitude, if you tell me to fix Social Security, I'll go do it, but you're not going to be happy. And I
That's
think that was very much so.
that's kind of that's the shorthand conclusion of 20 years in Afghanistan and
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Iraq, right?
But we keep trying to teach it. But some of this shiny fixation, I want to go to two different pieces of this question, not just the fixation of the military. One is the role of civilian policymakers in choosing instruments and policy. And I want to go around once and ask each of you where you see the greatest weaknesses based on your experience in high-level policy making on how you select and use these instruments. Then I kind of want to come back and ask you about where you see within your own specialty and your colleagues, not looking at any of the people on the panel, but where you see the greatest misconceptions. And some of those have changed over time. There's military, when I was in Iraq, I can't think of the number of briefing charts I saw that went through 4 phases, and the third was the war, the fourth was, to be determined afterwards by the civilians. And that's pretty much gone away. I don't think too many people are thinking that way. But going at the first one, looking at civilian decision making, where do you find, what is the biggest lesson civilian decision makers need to take away from how to use these tools? So Susan, you want to let you have a first crack?
Well, I think that in terms of civilian decision making, there has instinctively been a sense of use of the military in a way that sometimes does a disservice to the military because they're thrown into a context for which the ground has not been prepared. And I think we saw that in Iraq very clearly in 2003. There is sometimes a dismissal of those individuals or that part of the government that can give context and nuance and understanding and history. We go into parts of the world where they have long memories, and other armies have tried to do and failed, and we go in thinking that we're going to be able to do the same thing, and we sometimes don't learn the lessons of history. I realize that sometimes it takes time and it takes effort, and sometimes we're on a short fuse. But that instinct to turn to force first, and then think about, okay, then diplomacy comes later as we try to kind of clean up and move forward, sometimes takes us in directions where we didn't have to go, and it becomes more difficult to backtrack.
Ken, as you look at these different instruments, particularly of the timeline that one ought to be thinking about in development, my sense is that it is very difficult to bring the timeline of development into conformity with the timeline of politics. And I thought, would you, sort of look at this in terms of, if you're going to think of development as part of a counter-terrorist or a counterinsurgency strategy, what do you need to understand about the security context in which it has to take place, and about the time that you have to give it to measure results?
So I'll start with first an example of one of the constraints with respect to time, as you say, that the example that I have is when I was in Colombia, we hosted a congressional delegation, and they saw what we were doing at AID, and they were quite pleased. And the member of Congress towards the end said, the proverbially, "How this is really good. How can we help?" And I said, we actually have enough resources. It would be great if we had similar resources going forward, but what we really need is time. We need 8 to 10 years for this to really be set in hard concrete. And the congressman looked at me and said, "I cannot do that for you." He said, the best I can do is this congressional cycle." And so then we end up talking about a long-term effect of development, but having to talk about it in terms of these 2 year short-term objectives. It's been not easy for us in the development field to translate it into short-term bites, if you will. And it has been hard to talk about and get the support for this kind of a long-term effort. The other piece related to that also is that, Doug talked about the ends, the means, the ends, the ways, and the means. And oftentimes what we found is that there's agreement on the ends, it's an interagency agreement on the ends. But then we start to diverge on the ways, and we further diverge on the means. So the hypothetical example I like to give is that there's an interagency agreement that a road must be built from village A to village B. And then the AID goes off and starts consultations with the community. In the meantime, the military has already reached village B and is looking around and saying, where is AID? How come AID is not with us? And so not fully understanding sort of the timeline of the ways and not having a good enough understanding of the means that it takes to get there adds to, I think, the difficulty in having success.
Thanks. I'm going to go back to Doug here because I think this is a place to transition also into the question of what in cultures we don't understand about each other as you've gone through the decision process to try to get to the end results we're seeking. Where do you find either in the individual cultures of diplomats, military aid, or in the cultures of our political leaders who usually come from none of these backgrounds, the greatest obstacles to understanding or to effective cooperation?
I think
No, sorry. Go ahead, Ken, and I'll follow up.
Okay, yeah, no, I think the obstacles is both ways. From the development side, we invariably say it takes time, and the correct question is how much time. And we often have a hard time coming up with an answer that is less than, too long, if you will, in the sense of the political timelines that we have and we talk about, at least in this country. And then from the military side, and I'm going to expand military to a security sector definition. And so talk more about security sector, not just the military. From the security sector, I think what is often perhaps not fully understood is the one and out approach. In other words, we will go there, we will defeat and dismantle the enemy, and then we will leave. And the thought that we have to come back and back and back again is something that is not always fully understood, I think, especially from our counterpart countries. The other and the last piece is the discussion about, and we had this quite a bit in Afghanistan, is in whose best interest is it for the defeating the enemy, the terrorists, and do we have enough buy-in from the local population? And that's something I think that requires time to set up, and oftentimes we don't have the luxury of time.
So Ron, in response to your probing question here, I think the shortfall that comes first to mind for me in terms of the policymaking process is the absence of a deep understanding of local conditions. So I can remember countless times in the White House Situation Room around the conference table and principals. So these are the War Cabinet, right? So these are secretaries of state, defense, and so forth, are sort of bumping into facts that are being presented by some very bright young intelligence officer that changes completely the complexion of the conversation at the table. And when I talk about deep understanding, I'm talking about understanding the political culture, as Susan suggested, understanding the history, understanding the regional dynamics, um, speaking the language, understanding the interplay between the central government and the periphery, the provinces, and so forth. Now, look, we can't expect, the Secretary of State to have all that knowledge as walking around knowledge. But what's important in the policy formation process is that we gain access to that deep understanding and that expertise has a voice in the Situation Room. What I've learned in 6 years in the White House across two administrations and something like, I don't know, I lost track, but 300 episodes in the White House Situation Room is that oftentimes it's outside experts, academics, um, retirees, and so forth, who have studied, lived in the region, have deep understanding of the region, who can be brought in for an unclassified presentation that represents the kind of deep understanding that I'm talking about. Without that understanding, we can formulate a strategy, ends, ways, and means, but the odds of getting it right and getting the blend of military, economic, diplomatic, and so forth right is much reduced if we don't start with deep expertise. In my experience, and maybe this would be the fourth or fifth panelist on our session today, the intelligence community most frequently gets it right. And the reason I say this, as I think about this, is that the intelligence community tends to nurture senior intelligence officers with multiple tours in the same region, with a degree, advanced degree from Georgetown in regional studies in that region, with expertise in one of the regional languages. I can't tell you how many times I would go to visit embassy Islamabad, meet with the chief of station, and so forth. 6 months later, I'd go back and visit in Kabul, and this same individual is now chief of station Kabul. And in between the chief of station postings, he or she is back here as the head of the South Asian branch in Langley, speaks one of the languages, and so forth. So they're not always right. I mean, you can all probably imagine intelligence shortfalls here. But if a fourth leg, if this chair or stool has multiple legs that we're talking about, a fourth to consider is the deep expertise brought by the intelligence community. And that's typically where, in my view, we don't do a good enough job mastering the substance of the question before we dive into a solution. Maybe it's kind of endemic to Americans, right? We just want to engineer a solution. And until you understand the problem, you're not likely to get the solution right.
I think you could make a long study on our propensity to design solutions without reference to foreigners. There are some
Right.
studies about Vietnam. I mean, this is perhaps, to my mind, one of the greatest defaults in the academic approach to this whole thing is that we have this seems like inherent ill-built desire to build policy in Washington if things don't work, often without, and then we want to sell it to the foreigner. Former CIA Director Colby spent 15 years involved in Vietnam, and I remember in a book he wrote that for many Americans, the reason for failure was that the Vietnamese simply didn't understand and implement the brilliant solutions designed in Washington. And you could kind of replicate that for a lot of strategies. But Susan, let me go to you. diplomats certainly don't think that local knowledge is the province only of the intelligence professional. Why do you think we, as diplomats, sometimes come short either in understanding the local situation or in being able to convey the local situation? Or do we? You know, you can push back and
Yeah,
say, well, that's a failure. We actually do understand it and we're successful. But
I think in some cases we are. In some cases, we say things that people don't want to hear. It's as Doug suggests, it's at variance with the thinking round the table, what has already been sort of thought about and cooked up. It may be politically, domestically untenable. We haven't even touched on that yet, but that can be part of the policy process formulation in the White House or in the interagency process. I do think that we do have a lot of talent in the Foreign Service, especially those who have specialized in a particular region. I might add that our relationships with our colleagues in the intelligence community actually are quite strong. We work collaboratively. We work not just in cooperation, but we really do work in an integrated fashion, which I think is important because we help one another understand better. So I think in part it's what we send back, how we present, and also how we get our Washington colleagues at state to be able to also articulate what we are seeing. Sometimes the holdup is there, actually. You know, it's not always, oh, it's just the White House doesn't understand. And I will say that I had the good fortune and privilege of working with Doug Lute when he was in the White House, and I was ambassador in Doha, and we were working a very thorny situation. And what I did appreciate the most is when we got on the civets and we did talk, we always had the receptivity and the courtesy of being believed that this is exactly what we're seeing. Okay, we've got to think about this a little bit differently. And in that case, it was really an excellent partnership.
But, you know, thanks for that, Susan. It also reminds me, you know, Ron asked the question about how do we get this, how do we miscommunicate, right? And as a military guy, maybe more than the other branches of government, right? I remind senior military officers that we have to speak plain English. I mean, we have each of the bureaucracies has its own language, its own vernacular, and often we don't take time to step out of our little world and speak plain English to the others. I mean, I can remember sessions in the White House Situation Room where, you know, acronyms had to be unpacked. And sometimes even the unpacking of acronyms are not any more descriptive because those don't make any sense either, right? A classic example is at one point there was a disastrous, a tragic misidentification along the Afghan-Pakistan border, resulting in American aircraft killing 24 Pakistanis in Pakistan, right? There's just a problem of misidentification. And as a result, the Pakistani government closed the lines of communication, the famous GLOCs, so GLOC, ground lines of communication. Okay, and there was a White House emergency meeting about the GLOCs. The military guys briefing didn't take the time to explain that GLOCs are simply highways. They're just roads. Okay, why didn't we just say that Pakistan closed the roads from the port of Karachi into landlocked Afghanistan? And that would have been enormously helpful and simplify the conversation. At the end of one of these sessions, as a loyal staff officer, I was cleaning up the nameplates around the table in the White House Situation Room, and I overheard one very senior cabinet level civilian ask another, "What the hell is a GLOC?" So they'd gone through this whole meeting and not really understood what we were talking about. And so there's a real burden, I think, on all of the agencies represented in the policy-making process to step out of their own shoes and speak plain English in effort to just communicate better?
One issue that comes up, we're talking about this in terms of counterterrorism, and we're talking about it in terms of working in somebody else's country. So let me ask each one of you for a last question here before we go to questions from the audience. Where do you see we've been very good at putting coalitions together, but in terms of working with a host government in the field, your piece of the program, whether it's military aid, overall policy, diplomacy, where do you see our strengths and or where do you see our greatest weaknesses in having foreign policy that actually involves foreigners? I don't know.
Who are we starting with?
Okay. Well, anyway, you can start, Susan.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I think that first of all, we should be clear about what our objectives are and why we have this concern. And when we do it, we have to obviously show why it's in our host country's interest as well. I mean, that's like a starting point. It shouldn't even have to be articulated, but it's quite interesting sometimes when we have visitors from Washington and they start browbeating our hosts. And I kind of wonder what they expect to achieve in that exercise. Yeah, I know, Doug, you're laughing. I'm sure you've experienced it as well. So, for example, let me give an example on the issue of counter-terror financing. When I was in Qatar, it was an area which needed some work. There were some areas which were, shall we say, not being addressed adequately. But when we were able to articulate why it was in their interest, how we could work with them, how we could help them with training, why it would be beneficial in terms of their relationships with Washington, how we could use that in a way to leverage what they wanted from Washington in other arenas where they weren't getting traction, it started to hold more interest to them. And in the end, we were able to get them off of any kind of FATF regulations, the financial action task force regulations, where they may have been short. And that was a very interesting example of how we could work in the CT space and get not only the cooperation, but their willingness to go the extra mile. So I think it's putting yourself in your host country's shoes and understanding what they need, and then figuring out what you need and how to get to that place. It's very simple diplomacy, but it's quite amazing how people kind of forget that simple lesson.
Susan, there's a phrase that bounces around military schools and so forth that describes what you just stated, and that is strategic empathy. Now, sometimes we can quickly confuse sympathy and empathy, right? But empathy is simply the effort to step out of your shoes and into your counterparts, right? By the way, whether it's a friend or an enemy, right? It's important to try to understand the other side of the story. So having a touch of strategic empathy and having enough humility to admit that you can't design from Washington a solution for Kandahar province. It's got to have a local texture with local knowledge and local understanding and some empathy for what your local partners are going through.
Right.
Yeah.
This up and continue it. In many parts of the world, we can sort of force feed a strategy with money, but not necessarily its continuity or its ability to continue without the money or that it fulfills our need, and sort of leaving you a fairly open palette here to paint on. Where do you see the sort of the combination of what do we do or what could we do better in working with host governments to make the developmental piece, of which education is also a part, the work better or work at all?
Right. So two parts, Ron. Just to your earlier question about host countries and host country governments. And for AID, for us, it's more about host country communities.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons why so often it takes us that much longer to get a good sense of a strategy for the ways, to figure out what the means are, given that we have commonality in the ends, in the interagency, because we need to have a close association with community. So, Doug pointed to how do we work in Kandahar. That solution may or may not be available in Kabul. And so if we want to talk about Kandahar, we should be in Kandahar. The difficulty becomes if the security situation or other situations are such that we cannot be in Kandahar, then our engagement necessarily becomes long distance. And the longer the distance, the fuzzy the picture gets. And it just becomes exceptionally difficult then for us to be able to put together a coherent strategy. And if we're not able to do that, then to your second question, what happens in terms of the longevity of this approach? And stepping away from the strict counterterrorism situation, just development in general, we're always frequently asked about the sustainability word. And, how long do we need to be in a country before it becomes sustainable, before they can do things on their own? And we don't always have a good way of answering that question. And ideally, it's a government that has resources and skills and motivation and accountability to people to be able to provide that. But that's a very wishy-washy answer if we're talking about some policy decisions that need to be made.
I think we better let the audience have at least a chance here. Aline, what have you unmute yourself and tell us or give us a question or two, for whether it's for the group or for individuals.
Yes. The first question that was asked, it was asked towards anyone, but I think Dr. Yamashita might be more well versed on this. Anna Weber asked, how do we deal with the development approach going forward, given the dismantling of US aid?
I think that two parts to that. The assistance, if you will, the U.S. has provided assistance overseas for a very long time, long before AID existed. As a matter of fact, the first response to disaster goes back to the 1700s for an earthquake in Venezuela. And so assistance programs have been around for a long time. And I would like to think that they will continue long before the organizational structure of AID disappears. That said, I think a more interesting and useful question is that what are the structures and skill sets, for example, within a State Department that will make a robust assistance program viable? And we can have a long conversation about that, but I think those are the questions that we should be asking going forward.
No doubt, you're right.
Mhm.
Why don't we go on to the next question? Although I want to leave my colleagues with a chance to, come back and comment on other answers, but I don't want to fixate us on one question. So what's your next one?
Yes, we have a question from Sarah Abramovitz to Ambassador Ziadeh. She said, Ambassador Ziadeh mentioned the domestic political environment can have on getting approval on global counterterrorism strategies. How do you see how the balance in satisfying DC politics while having an effective method in the host country has changed with the present-day political environment?
Yeah, well, when decisions have to be made in Washington, there are all kinds of calculations. And it can be done through the rubric of the ends, ways, and means. I'm a graduate of the War College. I had to study that as well. But I think it also has to go into what is politically tenable. What will the traffic bear? What are the budget considerations? What are the other issues on the table that are of domestic consideration? What is the Congress focused on? Is it a budget they're trying to get through? Are there financial ramifications for whatever this foreign policy decision is, and how will it affect domestic considerations or domestic budget considerations? So all of this has to be balanced by a White House, by a Congress that has competing interests. And I'm not saying one is more important than the other, but they do compete, they clash, they rub up against one another. It's not an easy situation to sort out. So domestic can be local interests, it can be financial, it can be donor interests. We're seeing that increasingly in government. And then the question then becomes also, how much do we have the capability? For example, if it's military, what's our military capability? Where do we have troops stationed? Are we working in a particular region? Can we take on a second front? What are our capabilities? I mean, of late, we've even watched, and Doug, I'm getting into your lane, forgive me, but even can we move an aircraft carrier from one region to another? I've never seen so much ink spilled on paper about the number of aircraft carriers and how many we have in the Persian Gulf and what that means in terms of what we're taking out of the Pacific. So all of these kinds of considerations have to go into play. That's part of domestic policy, let alone what do we feel the host government needs and or is asking, or what's in our interest to be able to offer the host government that serves U.S. national security interests.
Thank you. We could have a lot of comments from ourselves on this one, but I think we ought to pass on to the next question, and we'll come back.
All right. The next question is from Yipsera Abati. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. And it's to Dr. Yamashita. He says, I would like to pose a thoughtful question for your insight. Is there an alternative path to confronting adversaries beyond direct conflict? Specifically, could strategic planning rooted in contentment, I think it's supposed to say containment, and understanding play a role before hostilities escalate? Moreover, do you believe that diplomacy, when used wisely and proactively, can serve as a powerful tool in the fight against terrorism?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. I would say that we need to have all tools at our disposal. I think that to rely just on one or the other is not going to get us the results that we want. It's easy to say, yes, let's prevent all of this. But we cannot do that without understanding what the safety and security structure is. So we cannot do that without understanding the governance, democracy, the diplomatic and political structure is. And so we need to have all of these tools at the same time. And it's not just about three legs of the stool and the interagency and the different institutions that are represented. It really is a combining of this toolbox that allows us to carry out a successful foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just echo Ken's remarks there, and just observe that in my experience, we do best at blending these tools and forming a team, a U.S. team, when that team is locally focused on the U.S. embassy in the country in question. And what this means, if we think about the four dimensions we've talked about here, the embassy already brings the diplomatic, the development, and the intelligence community under one roof, right? As the chief of station, as the chief of mission. What this really means for my leg of the stool, the military leg, is that they've got to be open to sometimes physically relocating into the embassy so that we don't have a situation where you have two American power centers in a faraway conflict region without sort of co-locating and becoming one team. across the 20 years of experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, it is more frequent that the four-star commander and the U.S. ambassador did not actually get along than it is common that they were teammates and close associates. So, and what I found is the magic sauce here is co-location, and that takes some it takes some humility on behalf of the military to leave our big, well-equipped, modern communication systems and so forth in our headquarters with large staffs, all designed to serve us, right? Get out of that comfort zone, walk across the street, or in some cases beneath the street and through a tunnel, and get to the U.S. Embassy and consider that your place of business. And when we've achieved that, when video teleconferencing into the White House Situation Room, the ambassador and the general are sitting side by side in the embassy, or alternatively in the military headquarters, it's a much different effect than if they're across the street from one another, but they can't even bother to come together on the video screen. So it takes some humility to put this team together. But I think the most logical place for it to form in the country in question is in the embassy, and we didn't often pull that off.
Well, it is a debility in our entire decision-making structure that there is no point at which the civilian and military chains of command come together, except in the President of the United States, who may be too busy.
Right.
But I don't know if co-location will always solve it. When I first went to Baghdad, the civil and military leaders were in opposite wings of the same building, and they hated each other. So it won't necessarily.
But there was another time in Baghdad where the two shared the same office. They had a common front office.
Yeah, I was there. I was there.
Yeah. Okay.
But they got along. They got along outside their shared office.
Yeah, fair enough.
At one point, I think General Casey was asked if he wanted a political advisor, and he said he had Newman, Ford, and Jeffrey. What more did he want?
That's the right approach.
Yeah. So anyway, we got along. So Aline, I think we got time for another one.
Yes.
Go ahead.
We got a question from Jed Hashim, and it's directed to anyone on the panel. What are your thoughts on a potential Palestinian state, and what would it look like?
I'm not sure that this is within the subject of the question of the panel, and it's a temptation to go way outside, and we got about 3 minutes left. So
that might be the next panel.
That might be the next panel. And I'm going to throw one in to begin with, and then let's see who wants to. But I would say, without a Palestinian state, I cannot imagine a state of peace. And with the current leadership on both sides, I cannot imagine it either. Susan, you want to?
I wouldn't be able to improve on that statement, Ron. Thank you.
Anybody else who wants to have a crack? We do have a couple of minutes left.
Do we have another question?
We do, yes. This question is from Rich Hinman. Counterterrorism and counterinsurgency are actually two very different mission sets, although we often use the term somewhat interchangeably. Does the panel have any thoughts on how these two missions are related and what different military and civil policy responses should each entail?
Well, I can take a crack at that. So the question is, I think, right on its premise, which is these two missions are very different, but they often operate alongside one another concurrently. So in Afghanistan or in Iraq, there were counterterrorism forces, counterterrorism efforts focused on the high-end Al-Qaeda in Iraq, for example, or later ISIS. And those missions were operating alongside an effort to protect the government from insurgents. The question's telling, however, because we often conflate these two, and we don't understand perhaps the difference. But there is a very distinct difference between counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. And from the military perspective, they often involve sometimes unique forces, so high-end counterterrorism forces, and sometimes conventional forces that are doing both. So it gets very confusing. And it goes back to one of the points we made earlier this evening, which is clarity of mission and understanding the difference between counterterrorism and counterinsurgency and who's got the lead in each. So this is a very root issue with regard to this problem, because seldom do you have, unless you're dealing with a hostage issue, right? Seldom is it purely a short-term, temporary counterterrorism mission. More often, you have counterterrorism playing out as part of an insurgency or part of a counterinsurgency. So they blend and overlap to a significant degree.
Ken, since aid is often drawn on as, sort of simplistic, if we'd make them happy, they wouldn't do this. Do you want to talk for a second on this, continuing this question?
Yeah. So
where is aid? Where is the appropriateness of aid in both counterterrorism and counterinsurgency?
The intersection, if you will, in counterterrorism and counterinsurgency is the security sector. And it's a sector that, for all kinds of reasons, that's yet another panel topic. For all kinds of reasons, AID is an organization, and pretty much the development industry worldwide has stepped away from. And I would suggest that we are hampered for having stepped away or never stepped in. I think that development of the security sector should go hand in hand with development of the social sector, the economic sectors, and the political sectors, and that all of these sectors need to develop in tandem, and keeping in mind that the unit of analysis in terms of who we are trying to serve is, at the end of the day, in the communities, is the people of that country.
I think that is hugely important. One might also suggest that it is particularly important in Washington to understand the distinction between the counterinsurgency and the counterterrorist. And certainly we went through a period in Afghanistan where it was politically unacceptable to define the mission as a counterinsurgency, which certainly did not help the clarity of our thinking. Eileen, I think we're just about out of time, but maybe we could do a quick run across whether any of the three of our panelists are just dying to get out a last thought that has been bottled up. We look at this counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, what means are appropriate.
I'll throw something out which is current in what is going on. It was suggested in one of the earlier questions, and that is, regardless of regardless of what happens to AID as an organization, there is value in having a robust structure of assistance within state, and my hope is that is understood and that is bought into by the current administration, so that however we think about assistance is backed up by a robust structure and a skill set that can carry forward our assistance strategies and policy.
Last desires, Susan, Doug?
I think the only thing that I would comment on, and because I know we have a number of students on this call, the importance of the cross-pollination and cross-education as we as professionals have gone through our careers. And in the past, for example, I did work with AID actually before coming into the Foreign Service. So I had some sense of AID. I was on an AID project for the Middle East. the fact that I spent a year at the National War College and I learned a lot about how the military thinks and how they react. And what is of importance to them, which helped me tremendously in my more senior positions in the Gulf, where I dealt with the military almost on a daily basis. And the fact that the relationship with your co-commander in country as the chief of mission is vital to making sure that you're aligned and moving forward. And having had those relationships in my training coming up the ranks was very important. So the idea that the more experiences you can bring under your belt as you develop your way forward is going to really enhance your ability to be an effective diplomat. And for the students on this call, that's some message I would like to leave.
Let me just close by amplifying what Susan just said. Oftentimes, these trusting relationships are based on personalities. And I think one of the best pieces of advice for young folks in this arena, whether they're in the intelligence community, the development community, the diplomatic, or the military, is to be the best possible teammate. And to be someone who listens, who has empathy for and respect for your teammates. And frankly, at this stage, for most of the people on the screen, we probably either got this from our parents or we didn't, right? But being a good teammate, being approachable, being respectful is the first step towards making this very complex equation work.
I think that is a great closing note. Of course, to do that, you have to be open-minded. I remember a wonderful quote, Oliver Cromwell to the Long Parliament, the British Civil War, that he said, "Think in your pride that you may be wrong." You need to be able to think and understand, then you can come back to the conclusion that you're right. Well, I want to thank, first of all, I want to thank Elaine Boutros for having conceived of this panel, that we throw this requirement on our interns, but we leave them a considerable amount of freedom to figure out what they're going to do with it, and then we try to help them bring it off. And so I think this was a great success. Elaine, congratulations to you, and to all three of my colleagues. Thank you very much for your willingness to give up an hour of your time, as well as the time in preparing and pre-meeting. And so I want to thank all of you very much for doing this. And I think that wraps us up.
Thank you so much for attending our panel today.
Thanks to everyone.
Thanks to all.
Thanks.